All right, so this is why your program sucks based on something called dynamic transference. So we're going to first define it. So definition of dynamic transference is exercise performed at similar intensities with similar joint angles to the competition lift. So SSB, JM press, block deadlift, high bar, close grip. Anything that looks a lot like the actual lift is going to have better carryover to the lift than things that don't look a lot like the lift. The problem that presents, if all of our exercises have very high dynamic transference, we get hurt, or the total training goes too heavy, or both, or we just don't have fun, which is a huge component of effective programming, right? It has to be enjoyable. So the exercises with the highest degree of dynamic transference are what we would call secondary exercises, most often performed immediately after the main lift, right? So deviations. So when we're understanding dynamic transference, we can't understand it in isolation. We have to understand it in terms of deviations, right? So each movement away from absolute competition specificity is one deviation. 2 reps versus 1 is 1 deviation. Another exercise, additional deviation. Another exercise for more reps, 2 deviations. Tempo, 1 deviation. So a 2-rep high bar with 3-second eccentric is 4 deviations away from the competition limit. So it's important to understand that we kind of always have to have this idea or understanding of dynamic transference in our program because we do still need things with really high dynamic transference as a vein or as a thread throughout our training cycle so that we know that the skill being practiced is going to carry over, right? What that may look like in, let's say you were doing doubles, high bar, 3-second eccentric, what that may look like is fatigue singles, low bar afterwards, right? So a set of 1 low bar is no deviation. That is the competition movement. So understanding that if we're going down the deviation rabbit hole or variation rabbit hole, we also still need to immediately afterwards practice that competition movement. So in the hierarchy of, primary versus secondary exercise, your primary exercise may be that variation with high deviation. Your secondary exercise may be very high specificity, no deviations, right? Or the inverse, right? So your main lift may actually just be the competition movement, and then your secondary exercise may be something with a really high deviation. That's more of a position builder, right? So there's this idea or concept in programming where if we're bad at a certain position, we just spend more time in those positions. If our chest caves in the squat, we would have an exercise in the squat that forces us to keep our chest through, something of SSB, a buffalo bar, anything that's going to force us to keep our chest pushed through. Why does this matter? An effective program has a blend of exercises with high dynamic transference, which is low deviation, and exercises with less dynamic transference, which is high deviation. The purpose is to have movement variability in our program, an important component of staying healthy. This blend of high dynamic transference and low dynamic transference is super, super important. Especially like when we think about exercises with less dynamic transference, those are going to be exercises that are purely hypertrophy focused or are meant to help us improve a quality that there's no way that we can improve with a barbell lift, right? So a lot of powerlifters get super, super tight because everything we do is in the sagittal plane. So getting into the frontal or getting into the transverse, it's going to have less dynamic transference, but the benefit of that being we are going to stay healthy. So understanding that not everything has to have dynamic transference, but it has to have a reason to be in the program, right? You have to be able to justify all of it. And this lens of dynamic transference, because that's all it is, right? It's a heuristic or a lens, is how we determine what's going to carry over. And not everything's going to carry over, but some things may keep us healthy or build muscle, which gives us a better opportunity to be stronger, right? It's not a one-to-one. It's not more muscle mass is stronger. It's more muscle mass if potentiated is stronger because you have a greater amount of cross-sectional area, right? Anyways, cardinal sins. Program too far down the variation rabbit hole or too many deviations is going to fail to be effective, right? I made this mistake very early on in my coaching career where I was like, I'm going to do SSB tempo 5s and then 3s and then 2s. And then I'm going to start a meet prep. And then I had to make up, 40% of absolute intensity over the course of, a 10-week prep. That's not fun, especially if you have 3 deloads in there or 2 deloads in there. Because now it's, 40% over 8 weeks, which is looking like 5% a week. And it's probably not going to feel good, right? Because they're not used to that. And then as an additional aside with this, we want to also be thinking about things in terms of absolute and relative intensity. So absolute intensity is the weight on the bar. Relative intensity is perception of strain. So a good heuristic for the secondary exercises and accessory exercises is we want to have a high degree of relative intensity, but a moderate to low degree of absolute intensity, right? You don't want to do a 1 rep max JM press because it's going to have very high absolute intensity and potentially has very high relative intensity, but that does not a healthy lifter make. So variations fail to be effective, or too many variations or deviations fails to be effective. A program that's too specific will fail to keep the lifter healthy. See this all the time in USAPL guys. They do low bar year round. Maybe they'll do tempo singles instead of regular singles, and they'll do fucking bell squat, goblet squat, leg curl. Not the move, dude. Not going to make it. Could get hurt. Much higher chance to get hurt because you have no movement variability. But at minimum, it's a very boring and lame way to train. You're going to get cyborgs who love to train that way. They're like, I don't care. But those people are few and far between. Most people need to enjoy the training. Cardinal sins continue. So very commonly in conjugate, lifters will dramatically lower their secondary exercise to the point that the main exercise, or that the exercise doesn't carry over the main lift. So doing a low bar 1.5 with 35% of your 1 rep max for a couple of doubles, it's not it, dude. It's not going to work, right? Your strain's too low, right? So your relative intensity is too low. Absolute intensity is too low. Relative intensity is too low. It's not going to improve technique. It's not going to build strength. And we would typically consider that like junk volume or a junk exercise, which is like, it's not, there's no reason for it to be in the program because it's not improving on a quality we're trying to improve on, right? Like the amount you can fuck up in a 1.5 squat at 35% of your max and still have it look good is pretty high. Secondary exercise and conjugate are usually meant to be position builders. So the thing about position builders is if you struggle with chest cable on the squat and you're doing SSB as your secondary, you have to have a high degree of relative intensity, right? You have to have a high degree of strain. Because when you get a low, you get a bar on your back and you get a squat bar on your back and you're in a low bar position and then that chest starts to cave, you have to have learned the skill of fighting back against it, right? And it's not necessarily that the absolute load matters as much as the ability to like think under that degree of intensity, right? You have to be practiced and be like, oh, fuck, this is really hard. So something to think about. I typically push people's secondaries pretty hard because I find that it has better carryover. And this kind of filters into our next point, which is how to put it all together. So accessories fall into 2 categories. We're going to have position builders, which would be secondary exercises. And then we have more pure hypertrophy exercises. And then 3 technically would be like a blend of both, right? So something like a JM press for 12s, it's going to be a position builder, but it's also a hypertrophy exercise. It's not great as a hypertrophy exercise, and it's an okay position builder, but it allows us to train a couple of qualities at once. So you need muscle mass to support specific positions in powerlifting, but you also need generally big muscles. So position builders with high dynamic transference won't always build the most muscle, right? So you're not going to necessarily JM presses are going to make you strong in that position. You're probably not going to build a ton of muscle from JM presses. But if you had like a single arm crossbody cable extension, it's probably going to build a fair amount of muscle because it's just in your tricep. So understanding that we got to have a blend of both, and then have relative intensity high on both, and understanding that as the workout continues, we start with a high degree of relative and absolute intensity, and then every time we go down, we keep relative intensity about the same, but we drop absolute intensity, right? You're using 70 pounds and you're single arm crossbody cable extension compared to 150 pounds in your dumbbell press compared to 350 pounds in your bench. That's kind of the direction we should be going. But the RPE should stay the same or similar. Closing thoughts. Programs should look like this, generally speaking, and your off-season and meet prep structure should generally look like this. You're going to have lower to higher specificity in the off-season into a prep, right? So you're going to start with more deviations and end with less deviations while still keeping a thread of specificity in there. Accessories are going to be higher specificity to low specificity, or less deviations to more deviations off-season to prep. So the main lift stuff's light. You can push harder on your secondary and your accessories by picking heavier stuff. Then once we get into meet prep, that flips, and then the main lift stuff gets really, really specific and really, really intense, and then the accessory stuff has to still have that high degree of relative intensity, but the absolute intensity has to start to drop off because there's only so much our body can handle, right? And that gets into this idea of like total workload. And so if we keep the same stuff in all the time and it's all kind of heavy, we're not going to feel it. Cycling accessories no earlier than 8 weeks, but changing sets, reps, time more frequently. So like I'll keep exercise in for 8 or 12 weeks, but I may, let's say we do a single arm dumbbell row. Single arm dumbbell row, 5-second eccentric month 1, single arm dumbbell row, 3-count pause month 2, single arm dumbbell row, no tempo, no pause month 3, 15s to 20s month 1, 8s to 12s month 2, 8s to 10s month 3. There's going to be a natural increase in the weight used. The eccentric stuff's going to be able to build better motor coordination. The pause stuff's going to build better motor coordination. And then we put everything together in our 3rd month, and then we can push really hard on it, set a PR, leave. So this is the basics of dynamic transference. There's a lot that goes into it. So to recap, dynamic transference looks a lot like the main thing. Exercises should be always viewed through that lens. Relative and absolute intensity. Relative intensity is strain. Absolute intensity is the weight on the bar. Variation/deviation is something that should be played with carefully. We never want to go down the variation rabbit hole / deviation rabbit hole, but we never want to just go down the specificity rabbit hole because both of those don't yield good long-term results. Anyways, I've been blabbing 12.5 minutes. I apologize. Goodbye.